this videotape, we're going to cover a number of portions of the skeleton. We're going to be dealing with the rib cage, consisting of the individual ribs and the sternum. Then we'll deal with the pectoral girdle of clavicle and scapula, and then the bones of the upper extremity. So, without further ado, we'll begin with dealing with the rib cage. Again, if you've got your syllabus handy, then you might want to follow along with it, or even if you have some bones handy, you might want to follow along with those also. And I'm pointing out the various different terminologies that are listed within your syllabus. So, directing our attention here first to the rib cage. Now, the rib cage itself obviously is known for muscle attachment and support for the pectoral girdle and protection for the thoracic cavity, but also its structure is vitally important for the breathing process. And therefore, we will see that this rib cage is quite flexible, so that it can expand and contract to facilitate inhaling and exhaling with your breathing movements. The rib cage itself is consistent of the ribs and the sternum. Now, first of all, in the case of the sternum, we'll do the easy one first of all. The sternum right here in the center, right on midline, protecting the heart and other vital structures of the mediastinal area of the thoracic cavity. The sternum, as you can see, is for the attachment of ribs laterally and for protecting mediastinal structures, and for descriptive purposes we take this mediastinum and divide it up into three areas. Those three areas are the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. Where those three individual portions are, this area of the sternum here, this is all the manubrium, the sternum. And then all of this portion through here would be the body of the sternum. And then lastly, this little tip sticking down here would be the xiphoid process. So I'll run through that again here, and that the most superior aspect is the manubrium, and then the largest portion is the body of the sternum, and then inferiorly is the xiphoid process. Now then, in the ribs, you've got 12 pairs of ribs, and to identify them individually, you just simply use a numbering system, with the number 1 being the most cranial. So, first rib, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, and so forth. Notice that in between the ribs, there are spaces, obviously, and each individual space is referred to as an intercostal space. The word costal in reference to rib, inter for between. And to identify each intercostal space specifically, you use a numbering system, with the number 1 being the most superior. So there's going to be 11 pairs of intercostal spaces. The first intercostal space, second intercostal, third intercostal space, fourth intercostal space, etc. Notice that the first 10 pairs of ribs articulate to the sternum by bands of cartilage, which on this model, of course, is plastic, but in real life this would be cartilage. It's an elastic cartilage, so it has a little bit of stretch to it, so that your rib cage can expand and contract. If this was a solid bone-to-bone type of joint, then you wouldn't have any flexibility with the rib cage, and breathing would obviously be quite difficult. These individual pieces of cartilage are costal cartilages. Notice that the 11th and the 12th pair of ribs do not have any costal cartilages. So on that, we can now define 3 different types of ribs: true ribs, false ribs, and floating ribs. True ribs are defined as those that relate with the sternum by their own individual cartilages. So, such as the first, second, third, fourth, etc. ribs having their own individual costal cartilage. A false rib is a rib costal cartilage articulates the costal cartilage of the rib superior to it, such as you see here with this rib here. Notice how its costal cartilage extends upward, blending in with the costal cartilage from the rib above it. So that makes that a false rib. And then the third category, the floating ribs, which are the 11th and 12th pair of ribs, floating because they have no costal cartilages. So again, I repeat, true ribs are those that have their own individual costal cartilages. False ribs are those whose costal cartilages attach to the rib above it, and then the floating ribs having no costal cartilages. Now, as far as evaluation on these, if I were to have just an individual rib sitting on the table for the lab practical examination, for example, then it would be unfair of me to ask what type of a rib is it. because in order to determine whether it's a true, false, or floating rib, you've got to see how its costal cartilages are arranged as it articulates to the sternum. So I would have to use the entire skeletal preparation in order to point out which are ribs are true, which are false, which are floating, and so forth. Also, if I have an individual rib, I'm not going to ask you, is it the 11th pair of rib, is it the 5th pair of ribs, or anything like that. However, looking at an individual rib, though, and looking at its individual component parts, we find it's really quite simple. And that you'll notice that at one end, you've got kind of a flattened surface here, and a bump here, as opposed to the other end of the rib, you do not have that type of an arrangement. So going to the end where you have some definite anatomy, then this flattened surface here is referred to as the head of the rib. It is here that the rib articulates with the demifacets that are on the bodies of the thoracic vertebra. This bump sticking out here is the tubercle of the rib. It is here that the rib articulates with the demifacets that are on the transverse processes of the thoracic vertebra. The area between the head and the tubercle is referred to as the neck. The rest of the rib is simply referred to as the body of the rib. Now, if we direct our attention to the articulation of the rib to the vertebra, then perhaps you can see that articulation. Notice here at this point here that the tubercle of this rib is articulating with the demifacet that is on the transverse process of this thoracic vertebra. And then if I can worm the probe in here like so, then you'll notice perhaps if this is visible, how the head of the rib is articulating onto the demifacet that is on the body portion of the thoracic vertebra. Now then, from there, we'll now discuss the pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle consists of two pairs of bones, the clavicles anteriorly and the scapulas posteriorly. It is these two pairs of bones that will serve to attach the bones of the upper extremity to the axioskeleton. So, looking at the bones individually, then this is a sternum. One of the things I'm asking you to identify is not only to identify that this is a sternum, but also to identify which end is which. The flattened end, if you notice looking at it compared here to the skeleton, the flattened end is the acromial end, called such because it articulates with what we call the acromial process of the scapula. And then the end that is a little bit broader in structure is the sternal end of that clavicle. That's where it articulates with the sternum. So the clavicle is not very much to that, just identify the two ends as well as identifying this as a clavicle.